While history often remembers the caliphs as patrons of art, science, and architecture, it rarely lingers on the practical systems of conquest and control that made their empires possible. Behind the gleaming mosques, bustling markets, and celebrated scholars, there were rulers whose methods of governance relied on calculated cruelty toward the conquered. These practices were not hidden, nor were they exceptional. They were documented by Arab chroniclers themselves, treated as normal instruments of empire. Consider the Umayyad Caliphate, the first great Islamic dynasty after the death of Muhammad. Expanding from Damascus, they established a dominion that stretched from Spain to Central Asia within a century. Their speed of conquest was unmatched, but with speed came severity. The conquered were placed into a system of taxation and restriction that guaranteed their submission. Non-Muslims were not forced immediately into Islam, but through higher taxes, legal disabilities, and public humiliation, conversion became the most practical path to survival. The rulers understood that over time, this quiet pressure would transform whole populations without the need for constant violence. The Abbasids, who succeeded the Umayyads, perfected these policies on a larger scale. From their capital in Baghdad, they commanded vast resources and oversaw one of the most diverse empires of the medieval world. Their rule was celebrated in literature as the age of Harun al-Rashid, the caliph immortalized in 1001 Nights. Yet behind the stories of glittering palaces and exotic courts was the reality of systematic enslavement. Harun himself is recorded as maintaining a harem of thousands of women, most of them taken from conquered lands. His administration normalized concubinage and slave markets, embedding them into the economic and social fabric of the empire. Further east, rulers like Mahmud of Ghazni carried these practices into the Indian subcontinent. Chroniclers wrote openly about his campaigns, boasting that he destroyed thousands of temples and carried away unimaginable wealth. To Mahmud, conquest was not only about territory, but also about symbolic domination. Temples were raised to demonstrate the powerlessness of local deities. Statues were smashed and their fragments incorporated into mosques. Millions were displaced, enslaved, or forced to adopt new identities under his rule. His chroniclers praised these acts not as cruelty, but as triumphs of faith and empire. The Ottomans, centuries later, developed one of the most efficient systems of conquest in human history. The practice known as the devshirme, or blood tax, institutionalized the removal of Christian children from their families. Every few years, Ottoman officials swept through Balkan villages, selecting boys to be taken to Istanbul. These children were converted, trained, and molded into the Sultan's loyal soldiers, the janissaries. Over centuries, hundreds of thousands of boys were transformed in this way. What made the system effective was not only the military strength it produced, but also the psychological toll it inflicted. Christian families lived in constant dread of losing their sons, while the empire gained an army drawn from the very peoples it subjugated. What made these rulers formidable was not merely their armies, but their ability to intertwine conquest with social engineering. Economic systems ensured that non-Muslims lived in perpetual disadvantage. Cultural erasure reduced the identity of conquered peoples over generations. Religious restrictions pressed upon them at every stage of life. And carefully maintained military institutions, built upon the labor and lives of the conquered, guaranteed that rebellion would be both unthinkable and unsustainable. The biographies of these rulers often emphasize their grandeur, the palaces they built, the scholars they supported, the poems they commissioned. Yet their power rested equally on calculated systems of cruelty that reshaped entire civilizations. It was not just about conquering land. It was about conquering identity, memory, and spirit. As we move forward, we will step away from the rulers themselves and instead turn toward the cultural and archaeological record. Here, in the ruins and in the fragments of lost traditions, we can glimpse the deeper consequences of conquest. The vanished languages, the extinguished faiths, and the silent temples tell a story that no chronicle can fully contain. When we walk among the ruins of once thriving civilizations, we encounter more than stone and silence. We encounter the echoes of lives reshaped by conquest. The great Islamic empires, in their centuries of expansion, did not only capture cities and subjects, They also left behind a trail of vanished customs, dismantled temples, and forgotten languages. These losses, scattered across continents, form an archaeology of absence. In the Indian subcontinent, much of this absence is tied to the campaigns of rulers such as Mahmud of Ghazni and the later Delhi sultans. Chroniclers recorded with pride the destruction of temples like Somnath, a sacred center that had stood for centuries. The temple's treasures were looted, its priests displaced, and its great idol carried off to be buried beneath the steps of a mosque in Ghazni. Archaeologists who examine the remnants of these sites note the abrupt breaks in continuity, rituals that ceased, settlements abandoned, and sacred spaces transformed. These silences in the archaeological records speak more loudly than words. In Persia, the transition was slower, more insidious. Zoroastrian fire temples, once the heart of local identity, were gradually emptied. Some were converted into mosques, their sacred flames extinguished, their altars repurposed. Others simply fell into disrepair as communities converted under the weight of economic and social pressure. Today, only fragments remain, ruins on remote hillsides, scattered inscriptions, and oral traditions that survived in secret. The absence of the once dominant Zoroastrian presence reminds us that not all conquests leave visible scars. Sometimes, erasure comes through quiet assimilation, where memory itself is worn away. Further west, in the Levant and North Africa, Christian communities once formed the backbone of urban and rural life. Coptic Christians in Egypt, Syriac Christians in Mesopotamia, Berber Christians in North Africa, all lived under systems that tolerated but diminished them. Over centuries, their churches crumbled, their libraries vanished, and their languages were absorbed into Arabic. Archaeological digs uncover broken crosses reused as building material, manuscripts overwritten with new texts, and burial grounds that testify to communities that once thrived and are now gone. The traces are faint, but they remind us of the cultures that stood at the crossroads of empire, slowly fading under its weight. And then there are the mysteries of language. Conquest often reshaped not just faith and architecture, but also the spoken word. Entire dialects disappeared as Arabic spread through administration and trade. Local tongues survived only in fragments, loanwords, place names, or ritual phrases whispered within families. Linguists who study these remnants often describe them as fossils of speech, small survivals of a world that once flourished with variety. To listen carefully to these traces is to hear the murmur of voices that empires sought to silence. As you imagine these ruins, scattered across deserts, jungles, and mountains, you can picture the slow passage of centuries. Stones weathered by wind, walls crumbled into dust, inscriptions half erased by sand. The voices that once filled these spaces are gone, but their absence lingers. It is a reminder of the fragility of human expression and of how conquest can silence not only individuals, but entire cultures. From these mysteries and silences, we move at last to contrast. For while the conquered endured restrictions and erasure, the rulers and elites of the caliphates lived in a very different rhythm. Their palaces, rituals, and privileges stood in sharp relief against the quiet suffering of those beneath them. It is to this world of luxury and contrast that we now turn. While the conquered often lived under the weight of taxes, restrictions, and cultural loss, life for the elites of the Islamic Caliphates moved to a very different rhythm. To step into their world is to enter palaces of stone and marble, gardens watered by intricate channels, and halls where poetry, music, and political intrigue blended together in a measured dance. The contrast between hardship and privilege is one of history's most enduring patterns, and it was no less so here. Imagine yourself in Baghdad during the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city, laid out in a perfect circular plan, gleamed as a center of wealth and power. At its heart stood the Caliphal Palace, vast and ornamented, with domes that caught the sunlight. Inside, courtiers whispered in corridors lined with carved wood, their words carefully chosen to please the caliph or to undercut a rival. The daily life of the rulers revolved around ceremony, greetings at dawn, audiences with petitioners, the recitation of poetry, and meals where delicacies from every corner of the empire were set before them. For the caliphs and their households, Food was not mere sustenance but a statement of power. Dishes were prepared with spices carried across deserts and seas, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, saffron from Persia. Wine, though officially forbidden, flowed in hidden gatherings where poets recited verses that celebrated both faith and pleasure. Musicians played the oud and the ney, their melodies weaving through the air as courtiers reclined on cushions. These were worlds where comfort softened every corner, in stark contrast to the villages beyond the palace walls, where a simple loaf of bread might mean the difference between hunger and survival. In Andalusia, the courts of Córdoba dazzled with equal brilliance. Palaces like Madinat al-Zahra rose from the earth in glittering stone, adorned with fountains, colonnades, and gardens fragrant with orange blossoms. Scholars and philosophers, mathematicians and physicians, were invited to share their learning at the pleasure of the rulers. While conquered Christians and Jews paid the jizya tax, elites debated Aristotle in courtyards lit by oil lamps, sipping sherbets cooled with ice brought from the mountains. For the common subjects, survival was often a quiet struggle. For the privileged, life was an exercise in refinement. Persian courts carried their own traditions forward under Islamic rule. Silk robes embroidered with gold thread, carpets of extraordinary craftsmanship, and jeweled goblets decorated the gatherings of sultans and viziers. These settings were worlds apart from the agricultural laborers who toiled to support such wealth. Yet even here, the rhythms of inequality were softened by ceremony, by the sense that the grandeur of the rulers reflected the divine order of the cosmos. To live in luxury was to embody legitimacy, and so the splendor was carefully maintained. Daily life for women of the elite was more complex. Secluded within harems, their worlds were filled with quiet rituals, embroidery, reading, and, at times, subtle political influence. For some, the harem was a cage. For others, it was a stage from which they could shape succession, policy, or alliances. Their silks, jewels, and perfumes contrasted sharply with the plain garments of peasant women who worked in fields or carried water along dusty roads. Yet both lives were bound together by the structure of empire, one sustaining the other in silence. What strikes us most in these contrasts is the rhythm of separation. While villagers rose at dawn to tend flocks or dig irrigation channels, the privileged awoke to music and soft words. While craftsmen labored in workshops, their products destined for palatial halls, the caliphs and sultans reclined among them as symbols of power. Yet beneath it all was a shared human pulse, the need for food, for shelter, for belonging, and for meaning. When we look back now, the ruins of palaces often stand alongside the ruins of villages. The stone survives for both, though unequally preserved. Archaeology reminds us that the lives of the elites, no matter how resplendent, were also fleeting. Their gardens dried, their palaces collapsed, their wealth dispersed. The contrast that seemed so permanent proved to be as temporary as all human arrangements. And so, as we leave the courts and palaces, it is worth reflecting on the balance of privilege and hardship, of splendor and silence. For the conquered, life was marked by endurance. For the rulers, life was measured by display. Together, they formed the dual heartbeat of empire. As we draw this long journey to its close, the echoes of the past begin to fade into silence. We have wandered through the shadows of conquest, through the weight of taxation and restriction, through the erasure of cultures, and into the contrasting splendor of palaces where elites lived in refinement. We have listened to the soft but enduring voices of families, villagers, and entire communities whose lives were reshaped, sometimes erased, by forces far beyond their control. History, when viewed through these quieter details, becomes less about the names of rulers and more about the rhythms of ordinary existence. The fear of a child being taken, the hush of a prayer in a forbidden tongue, the glimmer of a lamp in a scholar's study, or the whisper of a song drifting through a palace garden. These fragments, though small, tell us as much as the grand chronicles. They remind us that empires rise and fall, yet human longing, suffering, and resilience remain constant. The story of the Islamic Caliphates, like the story of every empire, is both magnificent and devastating. It is a story of learning and beauty, but also of conquest and loss. The contradictions are inseparable. Splendor cannot be separated from the silence that surrounded it. Triumph cannot be told without the shadows it cast. And so we are left with a deep stillness. The palaces have crumbled, the libraries burned, the fields once sown by weary hands long turned to dust. What endures are the lessons about power, about fragility, and about the human cost of empire. Let your mind rest now, not on the violence or the grandeur, but on the thought that every civilization, no matter how powerful, is temporary. Like waves on a shore, each leaves its mark and then recedes. In that rhythm lies both the sorrow and the comfort of history. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Let the images fade. The soldiers, the palaces, the villages, the voices. In their place, allow silence to grow. Let the weight of centuries drift away, leaving only calm, steady rest. For the story, like the empire, has reached its quiet end.